Hello guys, hope y'all are doing well. As we all know, Doom by Fate recently added a new survivor, Rith. And by recently, I mean 1 or 2 months ago. And to put it bluntly, she's kinda weak. Don't get me wrong, she's not useless. I don't think any survivor in the game is truly useless. Every survivor has something they bring to the team. The problem is that Ryth just doesn't feel strong enough to make her worth picking over most of the other survivors. She can be useful sometimes, but most of the time she just feels weaker than the rest. Now, before I explain why she's weak and outclassed, I should first break down her kit. First, we have Static Beat. Ryth pulls out her boombox and stomps it after a 2-second windup. Any killer caught within its radius is slowed for 2.5 seconds, while nearby survivors, including Ryth herself, gain the undetectable buff for 10 seconds. This buff prevents killers from revealing highlighted survivors through ESP-related abilities. And finally, we have Rhythmical. Ryth starts a rhythm minigame where you have to press the ability key again to hit each note. If you hit all 7 notes perfectly, you heal for 20 HP. Hitting 6 notes heals you for 15 HP, while hitting 5 or 4 notes heals you for 10 HP. Any score between 4 and 7 notes also grants a speed buff for 7 seconds. If you hit only 3 notes, nothing happens. However, if you hit only 1 or 2 notes, you instead receive the slowness debuff for 4 seconds and are unable to sprint. Now that we got that out of the way, let's get into the issues. Firstly, let's talk about her kit. Now, before I start criticizing it, I want to make this clear again. I don't think Ryth is useless. I don't think any survivor in Doom by Fate is completely useless. Every survivor has something they bring to the team. The problem is that Ryth is heavily outclassed. In most situations, you're simply better off picking another survivor because they can provide more value with less effort. That doesn't mean Ryth can never be useful, but when another character can fill the same role more consistently and effectively, there's very little reason to choose her instead. And her abilities are the biggest reason why. First, Static Beat. The issue with this ability is that while the 2.5 seconds of slowness is great, you're realistically not going to hit an experienced killer because of its painfully long 2-second windup. That gives the killer more than enough time to either walk out of the radius or interrupt the ability by hitting the survivor, making this ability very inconsistent and difficult to get value out of. Ironically, the complete opposite is true against inexperienced killers. Since they often don't know how to play around the ability, they're much more likely to get caught by it despite the long windup. That creates a weird balancing issue where the ability can feel incredibly strong against newer players, but becomes much less effective the moment the killer understands how to counter it. And, well, to put it bluntly, the undetectable buff is really underwhelming. The biggest problem is that you have no way of knowing when the killer is about to use their ESP ability. There's no sound cue or visual indicator, so you're basically forced to guess. And because Static Beat has a 2-second windup, even if you react the moment you think they're about to use ESP, you'll usually be too late. Once the killer has already revealed your location, gaining undetectable afterward doesn't remove the highlight. By then, the buff has already failed to do its job. In other words, the ability expects you to predict exactly when the killer is going to use their ESP, which just isn't realistic. Even outside of that, the buff itself isn't particularly impactful. Most maps are fairly open, so killers can usually find survivors without relying on ESP in the first place. On top of that, Static Beat plays loud music from Ryth's boombox, which practically tells the killer where the ability was activated. Instead of needing ESP to locate survivors, they can often just follow the music. And that's assuming the killer even relies on ESP. Some killers barely use their ESP abilities because they aren't that useful. Others have such a short cooldown that blocking a single use doesn't really matter. and one killer doesn't even have an ESP ability at all. So in many matches, a large part of static beat's effect ends up providing little to no value. Now, let's talk about rhythmical. To be honest, I don't think the speed buff is very useful. While you're playing the minigame, you're slowed so heavily that you actually lose more distance than the 7-second speed buff can make up for afterward. In most situations, you'd be better off not using the ability at all and simply continuing to run. That makes the speed buff feel more like compensation for the slowdown rather than an actual reward. That leaves the healing as the main reason to use the ability, but even that is pretty inconsistent. At best, you heal 20 HP, but if you miss a single note, your healing immediately drops to 15 HP or even 10 HP. And if you mess up badly enough, you're punished with a 4-second slowness debuff that prevents you from sprinting, which is practically a death sentence if the killer is nearby. On top of that, I don't like how little variety there is in the rewards. The only thing that really changes based on your performance is how much you heal. Hit all the notes and you heal 20 HP. Miss a few and you heal less. Miss too many and you either get nothing or a slowness debuff. The speed buff itself doesn't change at all, and there aren't any unique bonuses for playing exceptionally well. It makes the different score thresholds feel pretty uninteresting, especially for a rhythm-based mechanic. Another issue is that the rhythm minigame itself isn't very reliable. Even with good ping, the notes feel slightly delayed because of Roblox's servers, and if you're lagging, that delay becomes much more noticeable. At that point, it starts feeling less like a rhythm game and more like you're gambling on whether your inputs will register correctly. While I don't blame the developers for players having bad connections, I do think accessibility should still be taken into account when designing a mechanic that's entirely based on timing. Finally, I don't think the minigame has much of a skill ceiling. Once you've memorized the timing, hitting the notes becomes fairly easy and there's not much room to improve beyond that. At the same time, the rewards don't really reflect the effort required to master the character. I think survivors with mechanics like this should reward players for becoming skilled with them, and right now, Rhythmical doesn't really do that. Also, I think Ryth feels underwhelming because she only has 2 abilities and doesn't have any alternate playstyles or mechanics to make up for it. Compare that to survivors like Martyr, who has her blessed state, giving her a completely different way to play, depending on the situation. Some other survivors also have passives or additional mechanics that make their kits feel more dynamic. And even the survivors who only have 2 abilities usually make up for it by having abilities that are consistently useful. Rith doesn't really have that luxury. One of her abilities is highly inconsistent, and the other is so situational that it often struggles to provide meaningful value. As a result, her kit ends up feeling much more limited than the rest of the roster. Now that we've gone through the mountain of issues, let's get into some possible fixes that could really help Rith. For static beat, I think the wind-up should be reduced to around 1 second. If the ability hits the killer, it should apply a brief slowness effect for around 1 second while also launching and knocking the killer back. However, the ability should still be interruptible if the killer damages Rith during the wind-up. This would make the ability much more consistent without making it unfair. Newer killers would no longer be punished as heavily by a long-lasting slow, while experienced killers would still have the opportunity to interrupt the ability if they react in time. At the same time, the shorter wind-up would allow Rith to land the ability more reliably, making it feel much less frustrating to use. And for the survivor buffs, I think the undetectable buff should be removed and replaced with something more impactful. In my opinion, giving nearby survivors around 25% damage reduction for 7 seconds would be a great change. This would give Rith a much stronger support identity, as you'd want to use the ability on teammates who are about to be chased or are already in danger. It would also make the ability much more consistent, since it would be useful in almost every match, instead of only against certain killers. You could even add a second effect. For example, the harmonized effect. It could remove all current debuffs from nearby survivors and make them immune to new debuffs for the same 7-second duration. Not only would this make the ability much stronger during chases, but it would also pair really well with the damage reduction, allowing Ryth to protect teammates from both damage and harmful status effects. It would also solve one of the biggest issues with static beat. Instead of being a niche counter to ESP abilities, it would become a reliable support tool that always provides value, regardless of which killer you're facing. That makes the ability much healthier from a balance perspective, while still fitting Ryth's supportive playstyle. This would also have a cooldown of around 35 seconds. As for rhythmical, I think it should be completely reworked. Instead of the current rhythm mini-game, it should use a key sequence mini-game. You would be shown a sequence of keyboard keys and have to press them in the correct order as fast as possible. The faster you do it, and the fewer mistakes you make, the better your rewards would be. Instead of only changing how much you heal, the rewards should have more variety. For example, doing well could give you healing, a short speed boost, or even stronger effects like undetectable or damage reduction if you perform really well. If the speed boost stays, I think it should be shorter to balance out the stronger rewards. If you perform badly, you could still get punished with slowness or maybe even weakness. I also think you should still be able to move while doing the mini-game. Instead of stopping you from running almost completely, it should just slow you down a bit more. That way, you still have to find a safe time to use it, but you won't be punished as hard if the killer suddenly shows up or switches targets. I think this would make the ability much better. The rewards would depend on your skill and reaction time instead of just memorizing the pattern or getting lucky with server delay. It would also be much more forgiving for people with bad internet. If you lag, you'd simply get worse rewards instead of the ability completely backfiring. And because you wouldn't lose as much distance while doing the mini-game, the speed boost would actually feel useful instead of just making up for the slowdown. And yeah, that's everything I wanted to say. Overall, I don't think Ryth is a terrible survivor. I just think she's heavily outclassed and could use some changes to make her stand out more. Hopefully, ideas like these would make her more consistent, more rewarding to play, and simply more fun to play without making her overpowered. Of course, these are just my ideas and they're probably not perfect. If you have your own suggestions or disagree with something I said, feel free to let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear what you think. Anyways, thanks for watching until the end. I really appreciate it. If you enjoyed the video, consider liking and subscribing. Other than that, goodbye, have a great day.